Good evening, everyone, and good morning to Professor Rog'er Azevedo, who is joining us from Florida. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the opening session of the 2026 Chase Pre-Conference. My name is Dr. Noah Brandl. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Open University's Research Center for Innovation and Learning in Learning Technologies, and I serve as head of the Chase Conference Organizing Committee. We are honored to have Professor Azevedo here with us as our first keynote speaker. Although we had planned to meet in person, the current circumstances have required us to connect via Zoom instead. While we regret not being able to welcome you to Israel at this time, we're grateful for the opportunity to have you join us virtually, and we very much look forward to meeting you in person in the near future. So, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Rog'er Azevedo from the School of Modeling, Simulation, and Training at the University of Central Florida. Professor Azevedo is a world-renowned expert in the field of self-regulated learning, and his interdisciplinary research examines the cognitive, metacognitive, emotional, motivational, and social processes involved in learning with advanced learning technologies. He has authored over 300 peer-reviewed publications and currently serves as co-editor-in-chief of the British Journal of Educational Psychology, as well as on the editorial boards of several leading journals in learning and cognitive sciences. Professor Azevedo will now deliver his keynote lecture entitled Measuring and Supporting Self-Regulated Learning and Metacognition in Digital Learning Environments. Before we begin, a brief note for the audience. If you have any questions during the talk, you're welcome to submit them via the chat, and they will be addressed at the end of the session, where you can also ask your question live. Rog'er, the floor is yours.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Brandl. Thank you so much for a wonderful introduction. So happy to be here. Thank you, and also Dr. Blau for the invitation. And yes, I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you in person, but like you said, hopefully in the future. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. So we changed it from a workshop to lecture. So maybe spend about 45 minutes talking, and then we'll open it up to questions, if that's okay. Yes, so today we're going to be focusing on measuring and supporting self-regulated learning and metacognition in digital learning environments. We also call them advanced learning technologies. And if you look in the literature, other people call them technology-rich environments, etc. So really focusing on measuring and supporting, and then I'd like to acknowledge all the funding agencies because this work is also not possible without some major funding agencies from the federal government, from the military also, and then from very centralized specialty centers. And also some of our work is also influenced by some of the work when I was still at McGill University. And then we're also funded by the Early and the Jacobs Foundation. And we'll talk about some of those projects. So really want to focus on is the following, if we go to slide number 2. So kind of start off with a little bit of an overview in terms of the fact that there is a science of learning with advanced learning technologies. You'll find a lot of this work that comes from educational psychology, cognitive science, learning sciences, and also the field of artificial intelligence and education. You know, some people that kind of have discovered Gen AI, we see this a lot in the literature and some of these public forums. It's almost like, oh my gosh, there's this thing called AI in education. No, there's an entire field that goes back way before, ChatGPT came out, etc. Kind of want to give everybody kind of a global perspective on when we talk about metacognition and self-regulation, right? We're really talking about, at least from our perspective today, is the human's ability to have an awareness. Are you monitoring? Are you regulating? Are you evaluating? Reflection and activity. Those tend to be the very high level, macro level processes that we think that learners, any type of learner, when using a technology, will experience those and go through those processes. But again, it depends who the learner is, what the task is, and the learning technology. And really what we have been doing for the last over close to 30 years is really to use technologies to do a whole bunch of things. They're trying to induce those processes, like, trying to trigger metacognitive awareness, or we're trying to detect, because if you want the system to be intelligent, to provide individualized scaffolding, for example, it needs to detect. And today we're going to be focused on the detection and modeling, and then tracking and supporting and foster. Like once we know or have a good idea what the student needs, then how can we support and foster those self-regulatory processes, right? And that could be related to cognition, emotions, motivation, right, and affect. And then what we're going to focus on today really is not just the typical self-report measures, which have basically inundated our literature for decades and almost centuries, right, is use of multimodal data. So it's good to know that students have self-perceptions about these metacognitive self-regulatory processes, what we have been doing is using basically, we want to know how they're doing those processes and how they're engaging in those processes in real time. Right. And to do that, we use the multimodal data, right, which is log files. So any kind of interaction between the learner and the technology is captured typically at the millisecond level. Sometimes we have them go through concurrent think aloud. So the students who may be reading something about biology and then they'll say something like, oh, I don't understand this. That's beautiful because we can segment that. That means they're monitoring their emerging understanding. Then the question becomes, what does the human do? How do you regulate that? And if you can't, then can we use the technology to regulate that? And that could be with a pedagogical agent, right? Or any other kind of environment. We'll talk a little bit about that. Eye movements, facial expressions, physiological sensors. And then we also have audio and video recordings of the complete kind of a bird's eye view, the learner, the task, the context, and all their interactions, right? We're focusing specifically on CAMS processes. So that's the cognition, affect, metacognition, motivation, and social processes. And related to this talk is once we have a good model understanding of what the student, the learner needs, then the question becomes, how do we make it adaptive? So a lot of the literature is a little bit confusing because some people talk about adaptivity, some people talk about personalization, and then if you're looking at the game-based learning environment, they talk about gamifying a game. So what does that really mean? Okay, and I'm going to talk a little bit focusing on the assessment and support by showing you some of our current projects, and we'll have an opportunity to talk about that. And then hopefully Wednesday we'll continue with this, which is talking about, the natural language processing. How do we use LLMs? What kind of Gen AI tools, artificial agents? And then really want to focus on Wednesdays to talk about kind of this future of AI, which is the use of simulated learners and human digital twins, which are supposed to be replicas of who we are. Okay. So that's a little bit. So we asked the fundamental questions, right, as a psychologist, right? Is self-regulation across ALTs or advanced learning technologies, right? So we asked fundamental questions. What is self-regulation, right? What is it? When, where, and how is it occurring? How are students deploying? How do we measure these processes, right? What kinds of methods and techniques and approaches exist that we use? How do we analyze? Yes, we use traditional, statistical methods, but we use also mixed methods. Sometimes we do qualitative analysis, but we're also have been doing this is also using machine learning techniques, right? And now we're getting into the computational modeling because there is a whole other area in true AI field that talk about artificial metacognition, which is different than human metacognition. But what can we borrow from that field for us to basically design more intelligent systems? And then there's been a new push with people's dissatisfaction of how we can measure self-regulation as it temporally unfolds, is the use of complex dynamical systems, which philosophers of science have been using, computational models have been using it, biological sciences, etc. And then because I'm in the School of Modeling and Simulation, we also take it to the next level. Well, if we collect all this data on these humans, right? Well, how do we model self-regulation? Is it an avatar that basically says, well, if you want to increase your metacognitive awareness, you should do X, Y, and Z? Okay, that could be one, but can we use intelligent data visualization? So imagine a teacher in a classroom that has a dashboard, right? What information can we provide to that teacher, right? And then simulation. So how do we simulate these in different environments and different artificial agents, right? To maybe model some new approach to providing scaffolding. So those are some of the fundamental questions that really drive our research. And here I have a little snippet of some of the environments that we built in, right? So the top right is our typical student, right? Who is instrumented. We're collecting screen capture, emotions, log files, eye tracking, keyboard, physiology, mouse, think alouds, etc. But that's okay in the lab if we can just basically try to control as much as possible. But we also do work in the classroom. Well, it's not feasible to have that kind of setup for 30 or 40 students. So the question is, what research strategy do you develop? So when we do 30 to 40 students, let's say K-12, right, we typically collect log file data, right, and also pre and post tests of the content knowledge, right, and also some self-report measures. So we're missing all that multimodal data. All we have is log file. So what inferences can we make about these processes? Sometimes the top left, here's a high school student, right? Sometimes schools don't even have labs where we can actually put, our setups. So for example, here's a student learning about synthesizing compounds in chemistry, and the data is actually being collected in a wet lab in a high school. Or the bottom right, where we have two clinicians, clinical students, basically. One is using a facial EMG. You can see the sensors on her cheek and on her head, and she's wearing a portable eye tracker. And here we're testing some new technologies when we're dealing with nurse and healthcare training. Okay, so those are some of the big questions. Conceptualization, I'm not going to get too much into this, just want to say that related to measurement and support, there are many, many different conceptualization issues that we need to discuss, present, worry about, right? So some of them, for example, is the fourth bullet. What is the boundary in these metacognitive processes? When a human goes from awareness to monitoring regulation, when is it happening? Why is it happening? Right? And then the question is, if it's becoming maladaptive, then what can a learning technology or a digital learning environment intervene? And how does it intervene? Right? And unfortunately, some of our theories in educational psychology and learning sciences, right, are either too abstract, right, and they're not prescriptive enough. They're more descriptive, right? And the question is, well, that doesn't really help with those of us who also design intelligent systems, right? So there's a lot of work to be done. There's developmental differences that occur, individual differences, right? And then from an assessment and measurement perspective this is all assuming that a human can externalize. We're making all these processes overt, so that everybody can see them. But what happens when you are an expert at engaging metacognition and you no longer talk about it and you have skills and knowledge? And so the question then becomes, invisible, if you will. We can't see it happening. Okay. So we have a couple of these issues, but what I want to talk about also is that, all our work is theoretically driven. Here's just a sample of some of the models and theories and frameworks of self-regulation and metacognition that we use. And these are very applicable to our area, right? Because some of our studies, we go back to the top left, that is the basic, right, Nelson and Aaron's model of of metacognition, if you will, a very simple model. It can be used for reading. It can be used for really anything. Okay. Then over here on the right hand, next to it in the orange and blue is computational model of metacognition that has occurred. The third one here is one that we have used extensively. That's the Winnie and Hadwin model of information processing theory, right? That also makes assumptions about the phases, the sequences, the operations that a human goes through as they're learning about really any kind of topic within learning technology, whether it's a game, an intelligent tutoring system, etc. We also see a lot of work by Dunlosky that differentiates the monitoring component from the control or the regulation aspect, right? Here, just to show you that according to some theories or models like this one, there is an expected time during learning or performance or reasoning or problem solving when a human should be deploying some of these processes, right? But then also some of our work has to do with not just cognition, metacognition, but sometimes our students get frustrated because the content is too hard, right? Or they need scaffolding and they're not getting scaffolding. So we use the Mellon-Gracer model of affect, okay? And then on the bottom here, you have two different models of emotions that come from other disciplines. So we have Klaus Scherz and then we have James Gross, right? One question and one thing that we would like to continue doing is, this is a model of emotion regulation, is can we embed emotional regulation in our digital learning environments, right? So the students can actually attempt to or see a model like, how do I stop ruminating? How do I engage in cognitive reappraisal? Because I know that's better than rumination, right? And then on finishing off here on the bottom left is work by our dear colleagues Sandy Yarvala and Alison Hadwin and their colleagues on socially shared regulation, right? In some cases, we have two humans interacting with, let's say, a game environment. Sometimes it could be a human and an artificial agent. So the question becomes, how do we extend models of self-regulation into socially shared regulation, externally regulation, co-regulation, all right? So a lot of this work has been done. And this work is now actually more important because as people start using Gen AI, the question becomes, is Gen AI? What is Gen AI, okay? Just to give you a snippet before we talk about more data, here's a snippet of some of the work that we do, just to show you that we cut across different, sorry, not to be disrespectful to ourselves as humans, across humans, okay, tasks and content. So the top left is we have been doing tons of work on Crystal Island, which is a game-based learning environment. Here, students have to self-regulate because they're learning about microbiology and they're learning how to engage in the scientific reasoning process. Bottom left is, again, an example of multimodal data during complex problem solving. So a student who's using a game-based learning environment, this is typically what they would look like, a fully instrumented student. The top right here is we do a lot of work also here. The digital learning environment is not a typical technology. It's the high-fidelity mannequin. Okay, it's a clinical healthcare mannequin. So in this case, for example, we work with one of our children's hospital where we actually model and simulate using a mannequin of a child, a resuscitation process, which we know that if a child is not resuscitated, right, then they die. So here we look at team performance, right, with nurses and pediatricians who are residents and sometimes emergency medicine, and they have 7 minutes to save the child. So the question is that this child will communicate or try to communicate with the team. Okay, so here in this case, it's high stress environment where you're not just learning about the cell structure. Here you are actually saving lives. Okay, our new work here is on simulated learner. I'll talk more about this on Wednesday during the keynote. Is the imagine a student, a high school student who's having trouble with algebra problem solving, right, gets to actually teach her simulated learner how to solve the problem and also about her self-regulatory skills that she would use. And then she basically would get to see her agent, her simulated learner, model all these processes. But what the student doesn't know is that sometimes the simulated learner will deviate, make more errors, use different strategies, because we want that to be the trigger for the student to say, hey, I didn't ask you to do that. That's not a strategy. Is that better? So in one way to accumulate and learn metacognitive knowledge and problem solving. In some cases, we talk about system beliefs. So for example, here's an open learner model. This comes out of Judy Kay's work. She's at the University of Sydney. Is a lot of our AI systems make decisions, for example, about adaptivity and scaffolding, but we never really tell the students or show them why we're scaffolding them in a particular way. So an open learner model is a data visualization tool that basically takes the beliefs of the AI system and shows them to the learner so they can understand and they can potentially negotiate, right? It's like, oh, you think I'm a really poor self-regulator. Well, why is that? I don't think that is true. So let me basically, through sliders, use the data visualizations to improve the system. Sometimes we try to accelerate their learning by showing them some of their heat map, which is their attention allocation, okay? We also do a lot of work in VR. And then the top one here, which I'll also talk more about tomorrow, here's Megan. Megan is one of my postdocs. And we have created a digital twin of Megan, who lives in a box. And we're using NLP and AI to basically imagine you talking to your future self. Megan can be a teacher, right? So it's like, hey, I'm a new teacher. I'm having a really hard time, engaging emotional regulation strategies in my middle school kids. Can you show me, right, how to do that? Megan could be a student. Megan can be a teacher. Megan can be a parent. Some of our work in biomedical science, Megan can also be a clinician or a patient. Okay, so imagine being diagnosed with prediabetes, right? And we have all her genome data. Okay, and then the question becomes, well, show me what's going to happen to me in 5 months, 6 months, a year. Will I actually become diabetic? Okay, or if I don't continue to make any kind of changes, what's going to happen to me in 5 or 10 years from now? Will I lose a limb? Will I be blind? Okay, so can we do disease progression? So that's some of the work that we're doing. So yes, we're dealing with a lot of theoretical issues, which obviously, trying to be mindful of time. There's quite a number of them. One of them is these theories. Do we have theories? So their new handbook of AI in education came out in 2023. There's another one coming out this year where we kind of list a lot of like, how do we embed these theories of self-regulation into these different types of digital learning environments, right? Not just traditional, but like I was mentioning in mannequins also, okay? And so if we look at the literature in terms of the learning technologies that have been developed, right? Which ones have focused on SRL and have used SRL, right? So the top right is MetaTutor, which I'll come back to in the next slide. This is one that we developed over 15 years ago. It's about learning human circulatory system, and we have different agents, and each agent is responsible. One is for cognition, one is for metacognition, and it's a very kind of multimedia, hypermedia environment, very traditional intelligent tutoring system where we can detect everything that the student is doing. The bottom one, BioWorld, is from my former advisor who just actually retired 2 years ago from Suzanne Lajoie from McGill University. This is self-regulation also by using more cognitive load theory. And this is for medical students where they learn how to solve cases. Here's Crystal Island, completely different approach. Here, there is no AI in the system. Okay, it's a game-based learning environment. It's purely constructivistic, open-ended. The students get to basically, they have to solve the mystery in order to end the game. Okay. Our colleagues at Vanderbilt, Gautam Biswas, in terms of Betty's brain, completely different approach. This one is learning by teaching. So Betty's brain is this white box here, right? It starts off as blank. So the students are learning about ecology, and then they're teaching Betty by populating her brain, if you will, okay, with concepts and relationships. And then they get another student to go and ask Betty about particular, how is phosphates and nitrates related to the quality, water quality? And they can ask those questions, but guess what? Betty could only answer correctly if you taught her about that topic. So the kids go into these cycles of teaching and learning. Phil Winnie, one of our long-term collaborators, who also retired 2 years ago, developed G-Study, right, which is a very hypermedia, hypertext reverse environment where the assumption that Phil makes is that because when you highlight, right, you're actually engaging metacognitive processes, okay? And then one of our colleagues at NC State who's developed Sim Student, this is for algebra. And here, the students are actually teaching, almost like a sim learner, the students are teaching the simulated students how to solve these problems. So again, just want to show you that there are ALTs or advanced learning technologies or digital learning environments that have been using self-regulation, different models and theories. And the question becomes, where is the AI in some of these systems? Okay. And then one that I wanted to emphasize was the MetaTutor. This is one that we developed over 15 years ago. And well, now 4 years ago, we actually synthesized all the literature that we did in terms of cognition, metacognition, emotions, and motivation by all these co-authors. These co-authors were at one point in time either my postdocs or grad students who are now faculty at different universities across the world. Who led some of these projects, right? But as you can tell, it's got agents, it's got a self-regulation palette, it's got a whole bunch of a timer, table of contents, et cetera, because we wanted to be able to track everything. And that work with the original pedagogical agents has given rise to new environments, such as different versions of the MetaTutor, where now we actually hire actresses, for example, where we videotape them and take pictures, and we literally, if you will, peel off their face to make it much more so that when the student is interacting, for example, with her name is Emma, when she's interacting with Emma, Emma actually gets to respond to her so that there is some kind of affective connection in terms of engagement. And also using facial expressions to trigger some metacognitive processes. Like when Emma kind of looks like this, like I'm doing now, it's like you probably are spending too much time on irrelevant task content. Okay. So using verbal facial expressions and verbalizations to do that. And then what I wanted to show you is really at the crux of all this. So we also have a project, an NSF-funded project with 5 universities, 1 in Europe, 3 in the US. And it's about parallel programming, which is a very complex topic for undergrad computer science students. So what I wanted to show you is the kinds of data as we start talking about what are we measuring? So what I want to show you is different aspects of this. So here is a video screen recording, okay, of a student, an undergraduate student, learning about semaphores and parallel programming in this game called Parallel. And so the question is, okay, so here it's better than nothing because now I have screen recording. I can see what you're doing, okay? But think about it from our perspective as researchers and designers of learning technology. Well, what happens now if I have screen recording, plus I have the student's eye tracking in real time? This is creating a whole a CSV file, which looks like an Excel file with 250, because it's a 250 hertz eye tracker. I'm getting 250 data points per second as to what the student is doing. Okay, so that's a little bit better. Well, here I want to show you is now we got screen recording happening here. We got the eye tracking of the student. Okay, and what you're seeing moving really slowly here, that looks like a whole bunch of EKGs, is the facial detection awareness of affective states like curiosity, okay, anger, etc. Okay, but I turned off his voice on purpose because we're trying to figure out, like, the question is with more data, and here is the Holy Grail. Okay. Got everything you had before.
Okay.
He's going to talk soon.
You can toggle on the links to display all the time. while you build your solution. To turn it off, simply click this button in the sidebar.
Can you hear him?
Display all the time. Okay, I'm not sure
Yes.
about that.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, just to show you that so one issue for measurement is each of these data channels contributes to our understanding of particular self-regulatory metacognitive processes. But if you notice, the language is the one that basically contextualizes everything. Okay, and so these are all dynamic versions of different types of data, right, that we then use to understand why the student solved the problem correctly or was having challenges. And then we also have non-dynamic representation. So for example, after they do one level of the game, here's a heat map, right, that shows us the eye movement to basically where they allocated their attention more than anywhere else. Okay, so the question now comes, we have a lot of data, multi-data channel. Each one can make inferences from each of these, right? And then the question is, we also have summary data, right? So the question is, with all this data, we tend to use it as researchers to make decisions more adaptive, but also to understand self-regulatory processes using this game. The question, though, is, from a teaching and supporting perspective and training, is why can't we take these snippets of data, especially if they're meaningful, okay, and give them back to the students so that now they can understand? Because otherwise, it's what we typically do. Oh, you didn't do very well because you didn't do this. It's always verbal. Can we provide verbalizations with either static or dynamic representations of this type of information? Okay. Okay, so here's another example and that's one student learning about doing problem solving on a context. So here, just to throw you on the other side, here's an example. Okay, I'm going to show you this video. I'm going to show you is taken from the perspective, as you're watching the video, at the bottom of the table, okay, of the bed is the lead clinician. And these are the 3 team members. So what I'm going to show you here is the eye tracking data. Okay, these balls that you see here is jumping around. This is the eye tracking data of the resident who is in charge of saving this child who was born is on the verge of dying. Okay, this is a very precarious delivery of this child for mom and baby. Okay, and the question is, we want to be able to see that. No, I did the same thing on purpose. I turned off the audio. Okay, so this is what it looks like. So this is, you're going to hear, this is the guy whose eye tracking you're seeing from a different angle. So here, now let's hear the whole process.
And then do like the 1, 2, 3.
Okay. So it's looking. So
Let's ventilate, please. Let's ventilate. Job thrust, have a good mask seal.
So he's giving the team members. You can see what he's looking at. We've actually isolated areas.
The next steps would be intubation, correct? I mean, how long should we try this until?
And the baby, actually, the mannequin, since that's a focal point, has multiple areas of interest. Okay, so we're trying to figure out medical errors, and then how does this resident, who has very limited clinical experience, basically managing themselves and also monitoring and regulating their entire team in order to save the child. Okay, so looking here, we're looking more at performance and medical errors, okay, but also still self-regulation. And here's some other examples of the work we do. In some cases, we have game-based simulations where there's a pandemic. This used to be our favorite game-based learning environment. Okay, and I'll tell you in a second why. I'll go back to, I'll leave it there for a second until we go to the next slide. We also do work in the military. So we have very low fidelity simulation of a tank commander. Okay, so basically looking. So here's some more kids using VR. And then I will show you, yeah, so we'll come back to that. Methodological issues, we have tons. So we typically, in most of our research, there's always at least one instrumented learner. Sometimes we have 2, sometimes we have 3. There's always some research component. And then really want to emphasize that was exemplified by the research that we do, is our experiments tend to be, longer. They're not just a 30 minutes. They tend to be multi-day. Okay, and then the question becomes, where do we administer our learning outcomes? When and where do we administer our self-report measures, et cetera? Something that we have not done yet that we're planning on doing starting this year is also doing retrospective analysis of giving the participant, let's say, or the human, it could be a teacher, it can be a student, really anyone, a break, and then basically show them their multimodal data back. Now, to come back to, this used to be our favorite environment is called Outbreak Simulator. We're working with colleagues in data science and actually epidemiology is that they mapped, unfortunately, the video doesn't work. Our university security system just kicked in something. But basically, students can see what happens. They can create a virus. They can then deploy the virus on anywhere in the United States. So let's say they create a virus, they put it in New York City and compare New York City versus, let's say, Orlando. And it's about population dynamics. They get to see how many people are incubating, how many people are dying, how many people are not affected, et cetera. And then the idea is to have these meta-humans be part of the scaffolders, if you will. So what I wanted to show you is here's an example of what it looks like. Here's an undergrad student from our Burnett School of Biomedical Sciences. So they need to know something about viruses. And so, here's an example. At this point in time,
how many vaccine doses per day average could be delivered for this simulation?
Oh, he's fully instrumented, so he's learning about how to create a virus. So he gets to a point where after he creates a virus, and then he basically
Florida
unleashes the virus, and it generates a whole bunch of data visualization. We're trying to see if he's making the right inferences. Okay. So we asked the global question, is this you're actively monitoring, regulating their learning, right? What are they learning? And how do we know? That's the basic fundamental. So this, as I was mentioning, this was funded 2.5 years ago when with our previous administration. And on April 1st of last year, almost 10 months ago, given the new administration, they figured that we should not be teaching anyone about pandemics or preparing for pandemics. So this was an NIH-funded project that was terminated by the federal government without any notice. So we are trying to figure out ways to still be able to teach students, right, K-12 and even college students about pandemics, because obviously it is an extremely important topic without being too confrontational, if you will, with our regime.
How many vaccines?
So this is what it looks like. So we collect a whole bunch of data, right? And then what we are not going to be able to talk about today, because this will take hours, is then how do we, which features of each of these data types do we collect? How do we use that for a prediction? And then how do we use it to make our systems much more intelligent, right? And this is some of those are some of the citations by us and some of our collaborators. So all to say that what you haven't seen behind the hood is that this produces so many different types of signals. We have physiological signals, we have behavioral signals, affective motivational indicators, cognitive, metacognitive indicators, and contextual information. And the question becomes for us, is this usually the bottleneck is how do we take all this data, how do we temporaline the data, which data channels do we focus on, and what inferences are we making? And is it just for pure publication, or is it then also for design when we work with our computer science and AI and even game-based learning environment colleagues to design new environments? And again, not to scare you, so to take it to the next level is, if you think about just even the work that we do in VR, is it produces a lot of processes, metrics, and inferences. And the red line is basically, so for example, if you were just to collect log file data, right, these are examples of the kinds of metrics that you'd be able to extract from those, okay? And also, those are some of the inferences that you're able to make, okay? And so some data channels contribute very idiosyncratic, right, or very specific processes, but sometimes we also have across data channels where you're able to capture the same data. So then you can at least converge data, okay? And this is just a snippet. This is not obviously all of the entire data that can be generated. So for multimodal data, it's not perfect. Not many people want to do this because it's expensive, it's time consuming, it takes a lot of training, right? And then here are some of the data issues that we deal with, right? We have privacy issues, of course, ethical issues, right? So for example, we're collecting data in a school. Well, we have to ask parents, we actually provide them a list of all the data, and they indicate which data they would allow us to collect on their children. So a lot of parents, of course, they don't want their children's facial expression data to be collected, right? We have some counties that will not allow us to collect physiological data on the children, okay? So we work with the parents in terms of being respectful, right? So that's extremely important, ethics. But sometimes it's also very incomplete data, right? The data is messy. There's lots of volume Okay, so there's a lot of issues to deal with. And we've actually going back all the way back to 2015, in one of our chapters in the Handbook of Cognition and Education of Dunlosky and Ross, and we actually try to help the community understand that depending on if you're looking at quality and quantity, these are, for example, the issues that you can deal with. These are the sample data that you would collect. And then part of this chapter is to provide researchers with, here are the types of questions, research questions and hypotheses that you can ask from this different types of data, okay, and analyses. So yes, so not to go into this, I'm trying to be mindful of time. Where are we at now? 12:07, yeah. So there's major accomplishments that have been done. Obviously, generative AI is really pushing the envelope and allowing us to collect a lot more data and having systems that are much more adaptive, even though, of course, they hallucinate, but they're not perfect. One thing I wanted to mention also is when it comes to measurement and support is that we as a science, right, we're still in this kind of very descriptive, we're describing stuff. And that's fine. But the question becomes and you see this in the learning analytics community, is when can we get to predict? Have I collected enough eye tracking data of, let's say, a middle school student learning about biology and examining a very complex cell? Have we collected enough data maybe after 5 minutes or 10 minutes to be able to predict that they have a good understanding or an excellent understanding if we give them an assessment? Okay, that's where you want to go. And then if we can do that, then when are we going to get to the point of explanatory challenges? When will the system have enough data on the student, let's say, and be able to explain, like, you've been using the system for algebra for like 3 weeks now. And what the trends that we've seen is X, Y, and Z. And if you want to improve your metacognitive judgments of learning, then this is what you need to do. That's kind of these two last pillars are really where we would like to go. Okay. So yes, and here's some challenges for adaptivity and personalization. We'll come back to this one tomorrow, right? And of course, those of you who are interested, right? Michael Giannako's, this is the 2022, there is a multimodal learning handbook. This is actually free. You don't even have to buy it for Springer. It's available online. Okay. And then Mohammed Sakir, who is in Eastern Finland University, actually also, this one is also free. Okay, this is a practical guide to using R, right, as a statistical technique for analyzing this kind of multimodal, multi-channel data. It's a really good. And then Suzanne Demoji, who's one of our postdocs on our Sala project, she's at the Radboud University, okay, in 2025, kind of synthesized 42 articles based on MetaTutor and the Flora engine, which is an engine that has been developed by Dragan Gasevich, our colleague, Maria Bannert at TUM, and Sana Yarvala and Inga Molinar. So if you're interested in those. And then so we look for, like, what does the future look like? Okay, so we continue to work with teachers and administrators on looking at, can we enhance instructional decision making if we had students who were instrumented, classrooms that are instrumented. One of our projects is, like, what is the classroom of the future going to look like? Okay, or when we talk about, for example, open learner models, let's give access to the humans and explain to them how we're making these decisions and understandings about their metacognition, right? Another one part of the Sela project that's funded by the Jacobs Foundation is the content now is their kids are learning. These are 12 to 15-year-olds are learning about AI for a future of AI with AI tools. Okay, so we're doing this massive, large, 30-plus country international study to compare adolescents across AI learning. And then we also use immersive virtual environments. Okay, we keep working on this. These are tools, are environments for us to be able to teach, okay, about self-regulation using different types of agents. Okay, and there are also data collection devices. And then, for example, at least in the US, right, is the issue of identity and minority students, right? So imagine you have a young high school African-American student who wants to go into health sciences as a career, okay, but minimal role models, opportunities. In this environment, she can develop an avatar of her future self, okay, where she sees herself as a clinician, and she gets to practice clinical skills, okay? So we made it somewhat very COVID related, but respiratory skills, but don't forget, she's instrumented. right? So as she is learning and practicing her clinical skills, she's leaving residue. So here's, okay, a heat map of the way she was trying to intubate the patient. Normally, you'd have to have the teacher there looking and doing it real time. Well, she's leaving residue. Now, the question is, can we use multimodal data to assess the quality of her clinical skills? Okay, so from an assessment perspective, but then can we use it also to support the development of those intubation skills, if you will? And this here is just to show you the kinds of data that we collect prior to learning, prior and post, the second and the third column. This is the multimodal data that we would collect while she's learning and using clinical skills. And this also has to do with career choice and interest in health sciences. So there are plenty of other retention engagement data that we can collect. And now we're moving into kind of the human digital twins, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow. So our university is funding the hiring of 38 new faculty members across disciplines. There's a lot of digital twin work that comes from engineering. So, engineers, of course, have a digital twin of a tank, a digital twin of a plane, a digital twin of an engine. And the question is, well, I'm a psychologist. I study humans. Can we have a human digital twin? Okay, so that we can potentially embody some of these processes and then have it operate, learn, solve a problem. Okay, so what does that look like? So, these are some of the projects that we're engaging in, whether it's a high school student learning with her digital twin about, eukaryotic cells. When we talk to some of our school administrators, they say, well, Dr. Azevedo, what we'd love is to have a digital twin of a math high school teacher, because that is the hardest thing to teach. Okay, so the question is, well, so we're working with them, and the question is, well, imagine you teaching your students and you have a human digital twin of yourself. What role does that digital twin play, right? What does it do to support the human teacher? Okay. We also have some military, so, digital twin of a commander in a 3-crew tank. Okay, what is a digital twin? Well, there's not going to be any room for a physical entity there. It's going to be more of a voice with a brain, if you will. And then in health sciences, everything from some of our work is also on patient education. So we deal with patients with breast cancer. So imagine here, right, unfortunately, our medical system could be better. You're lucky if you spend 5-10 minutes with your doctor when you go see your doctor. But if you're a patient and you've been diagnosed with stage 4, for example, breast cancer, well, the last thing I want to do is be rushed, okay, in terms of trying to understand what I have and how that's going to affect me and my family and my health, etc. If we had a digital twin who could spend time with and explain all the different options, etc., to the patient, or to help a novice clinician, okay, or in a critical care setting. So we're doing a lot of this work in K-12, as you can see, health sciences and the military. Okay, and here is also some of the work we're doing. So here's another example. So you've already seen Megan. So for example, here is Dr. Tucker. She's a physical therapy faculty member in our School of Health Profession and Sciences. And what you're seeing is 2 walls. It's actually a projection wall. Okay, it's a projection wall, and basically we're simulating undergraduate students in her physical therapy class who are learning to physically manipulate premature babies. These babies are actually mannequins. Okay, and the question is, how can we help that faculty member be able to assess whether those undergrad students are actually doing the manipulation properly, right? So not only have they brought the incubator with, okay, we can bring a whole bunch of incubators in here, but we're also projecting the stressors of being in this medical environment where you have babies crying, you may have parents intervening and interrupting the medical staff and other medical staff, etc. Same thing with some of the work that we do with nurses, okay, nurse practitioners. I'll talk a lot about tomorrow. Simulated learners. One of our colleagues here, there's a group that has developed Teach Live. Okay, one of them has retired, the other one has left, and the question is, can we model, right, these simulated learners, if you will, after real students, okay? And the question is, can we put teachers in front of these simulated learners? Okay, we've submitted some grants. Most of our colleagues here are focusing on students with learning disabilities, okay, and behavioral management in class. My question is, and what we've been trying to do is, well, instead of that, of course, those are important issues, is can we build different self-regulatory profiles in those students? So a teacher gets to learn what is it like to deal with the most unmotivated student who's got low metacognitive monitoring skills, very few learning strategies, and, basically doesn't want to be in class. Okay, how do we deal with that? And can we model that? Trying to be mindful, we'll talk about some of those issues, and let's kind of wrap up, if you will, with instructional assessment issues in AI. Okay, there's quite a number of issues. Two of the most important ones are the ones here that are elaborated. So what are the rules for adaptive instruction? You go to a conference like ARA or Early, and people are like, oh yeah, well, adaptivity is based on Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. I'm like, oh yeah, sure, that's great. But how do you know what those rings are for the zone of proximal development? Or we use Piaget. That's great. You use Piaget's theory of cognitive equilibrium, but how do you know as a teacher when assimilation and accommodation are happening, right? Those are very challenging questions. So theoretically, we can talk about them in a graduate seminar, etc. But the question is, what are those rules for adapting? Especially if you have multimodal. What do we adapt to? When? How? Why? And by whom or what? Is it the teacher? Is it the agent? And then the other thing that we're experiencing here, at least in the US context, is our teachers. I mean, with all due respect, they lack training on self-regulation, right? We look at the literature. Teachers are not very comfortable about engaging students' metacognition or even assessing metacognition. Why is that? Why are they not being taught that? That would be like me, I want to become a surgeon, but I'm not going to take anatomy. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, right? It's, and then the other question is like this lack of AI tools that empower teachers. Now, I know there's a lot of focus on dashboards, right? But what about beyond dashboards? So, for example, if you look back at this picture here, right, with simulated learners, let's say I'm a teacher, and tomorrow we're changing topics in chemistry. So here's my immersive environment. It's a chemistry environment. Okay, here are my 6 worst students. Sorry for saying that. Don't mean to disrespect students. Okay, and it's like, I want to introduce a new topic. I want to see how these 6 students, what are the challenges they're going to experience tomorrow in class or next week in class, so I can be better prepared, as opposed to just walking in and, hey, I'm going to hope for the best. Okay, but this kind of environment could also be for students. I know I'm going to have a problem learning how to, let's say, balance chemical equations, and these are the top students in class. And because I know I'm going to have challenges, I want to see how they're going to solve the problem, and can they show me the strategy that they're using. So when I get to class, I'm much better prepared. Okay. So being mindful, I'm going to come to these on Wednesday, a few to talk about. So there's plenty of educational issues to talk about, conceptual, theoretical issues, methodological, and then always in terms of the core of our research is what's the role in humans, right? Humans being teachers, parents, peers, artificial agents of different kinds, right? And yes, and this work is not possible, obviously, without the, a wonderful lab of ours. We have 20 students and all the way from undergrads to postdocs in our lab, and international collaborators that we really cherish and love working with. Okay, and I think we'll stop there to give at least people a talk time to.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Roger, for a fascinating talk. We will now move to the Q&A session. So if anyone in the audience would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, your virtual hand, and we'll call on you. We also already have one question, I think, in the chat, so we can start with that. Or if people, Guy already. So Guy.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks a lot, Professor Azevedo. It's a real honor to hear you today, and also thank you to the Open University for this opportunity. Your research is very valuable for us. I have 2 questions that might be related. The first one is that I feel that there is all the time ongoing debate on how these SRL skills are trainable. And usually it's connected to the brain mechanism and how limited we are, how students are limited in developing these skills. And it is related to the second question is, so first of all, what is your perspective on this issue? And the second one is, how advanced the SRL research in terms of neuroscience approaches? Because we know about EEG and EDA, but is there anything more advanced?
Yeah, no, thank you guys so much for your questions. Yeah, I'll answer the second one first, if that's okay. Yeah, I think that's a big, we need to connect more of, the kind of cognitive neuroscience research that we know, right, especially in cognition, metacognition, and even emotions, right, to the work on self-regulated learning, right? If we look at our models, we don't include that level of abstraction or description, which, we could do better. So, for example, in our lab, we're about to purchase a FNIRS, combined FNIRS and EEG to start looking at things also like cognitive load, right? Because only Annick de Bruins has proposed a couple of things in terms of cognitive load. It was actually in EdPsych Review that was just published last year, right? We need to start including like these processes, and with FNIRS and EEG, start providing additional evidence. And the question also is, to your first question is, which now I forget. I'm trying to retrieve the first question. I should have gone to the first.
How trainable
Oh, trainable. Yes. Yeah. So absolutely. And that's something that we haven't done, right? That I know, for example, Tova, Bukowski, and Braha Kramarski, right? And even a long time ago, I guess Zamira, right, did some of the work on Improve. I think it was for math, right? And that's for teachers. So the question is, can we move from stand-up delivery, right? Also, like Eve Carlin and Charlotte Dignath, right, in Switzerland and Germany have been doing and you guys have been doing some of this work, your team also. The question is, how do we go to designing potentially AI-based technologies for the actual teaching and training of those self-regulatory skills, right? Because a lot of the stuff that we see in the literature also is a one-size-fits-all, right, approach to teaching. Oh, first we teach metacognitive knowledge, and then we teach metacognitive procedures, and then we teach the most difficult one, which is the conditional knowledge, right? And so the question is, we actually have an NSF grant that is being under review, and the question is, can we stop building these digital learning environments or advanced learning technologies to focus on a particular type of student, the typical content, etc., and more importantly, can we develop a system that is teaching self-regulation across tasks, right? If that makes sense, right? And I think that's one area that we need to go, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Right.
So Tzvi also has a question in the chat, so maybe you'll already.
Yes, so I can just rephrase it. It's okay.
Okay.
So basically, regarding facial gestures and eye tracking, one thing I think we know from anyone who's given, talks or taught classes in different cultures is that it is very culture dependent. So, for example, in Israel, we wear our heart on our sleeve. We would, snort. We would be like, feeling like we're in the family room and express everything. Americans might be in the middle, and Asians, for example, in many cultures, you can give a whole talk and you get no visual feedback. How do you handle that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great question. Yeah. So from a measurement perspective, we always get baseline. So for example, talk about emotions, right? And there's also the different expressivity, right? A lot of this is culturally based, but also developmentally based, right? We know that children are willing to more bleed, if you will, through their face, right, to show that they're discontent, etc. Versus an adult, right? If I'm mad at the director of my school, right, I better do my best facial expression retention so that I don't get in trouble, right? So that is an adult. So we always collect data on basic emotions by you're being compared to yourself, not to others. Right. So, for example, when it comes to, let's say, facial expressions, there are databases that we use. There's a database for children. There's a database for African Americans also, because when we started this, let's say 20 years ago, when I was at the University of Memphis, the majority of the students were African American students. And because of the contrast in their face, the algorithms had a terrible time trying to detect, like even confusion, the A4. So we actually have an illumination system, right? There are differences between, like you said, genders also. And then the context, right? We have some context where it's basically trying to get the clinician to be empathetic. So the virtual patient actually accentuates the crying on purpose, right? So yes, absolutely. So we take it from, we try not to generalize, but of course, like confusion, any culture would show confusion. But the problem that we have also seen in the literature is when it comes to confusion, what they call the action unit 4, which is this furrowed eyebrow, is there's been a lot of generalizations. And we're like, no, I mean, I could look confused, but I'm not confused. I'm actually, if I'm solving a math problem, I may be actually in deep concentration, right? So yeah, so we have to be very careful and very considerate of cultural changes, developmental changes, right? And even, for example, some of my colleagues who do work, I don't know about you, but on students on the spectrum, right? And this also goes back to Guy's question, right? I mean, if I have not established theory of mind, am I even going to engage with an avatar, regardless? I mean, I can't even make an inference about your cognitive state, right? So yeah, absolutely. Very important questions. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Okay, maybe just one more. So I think some people might say that they object to the idea of measuring your understanding based on signals rather than on your performance in a test. For example, I remember, being in advanced math classes, some people, they would be like the chess players. They would gaze at the screen, actually it was a whiteboard, and they would look to the side, and anyone would think they're actually not in the scene, but their mind was racing ahead. They saw what they needed, and they were now processing. And others who normally would look, very normal when they were thinking very hard, looked like they were on the spectrum, if you didn't know them. All kinds of very strange behavior. And still, they would have said, I guess, if I would have said, it looks like you're not engaged, or it looks like you didn't understand, they would have said, actually, I'm the best student in class. Look at my test results. How do you react to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that,
Sorry, he's 18 pounds. I can't fight with it. Sorry.
That's funny. Yeah, no, absolutely. So the whole issue of individual differences are important to look at, right? And then I think what you raise also is this issue of expertise development, right? We're also making the assumptions that humans can express, right? So we collect data on process, right? Because we're also interested in how these processes temporally unfold in real time, right? And that's more from an understanding, right? But then we also converge, right? Most of the literature, not just our group, but many groups around the world, right, is how do we compare which one is more predictive? Is it the fact that I've collected, let's say, 5-10 minutes of your eye tracking and I can see how well you're going to perform, let's say, on a math test, right? Or is it just a math test? Because we're also interested in the process, which data channel is the most predictive of different outcomes. And what's interesting is we find so much variability, even some example in MetaTutor, right? We have students from pre to post who are in the control group who had agents, but agents played note scaffolding, who still performed extremely well from pre to post. But by contrast, we have students who are in the full agency, full adaptive scaffolding condition, who got the best support that we can provide, and still, let's say started with 50% and then ended 50%. And we're like, but you had the agents there to scaffold and you still didn't learn, right? So we're interested in those variability, right? And the question of why, right? And how do we support these students? And I think on Wednesday, when we have the keynote, we want to talk a little bit more is, now let's have the student be able to interact and talk naturally to, let's say, a Gen AI driven pedagogical agent, right? It's like, I think I'm still not understanding this very well. Can you generate a new diagram or give me a new problem that is less complex? Like, can we take it to that next level, right? So I hope that answered your question.
Any last question? Okay, so Shoshi?
Thank you very much. That's it.
Yeah.
So
it was mind-blowing.
Thank you.
I met you a few years ago. I'm a student of Dr. Billy Elam, Professor Billy Elam, and we met many years ago. So it is mind-blowing where it's going. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So let us thank our keynote speaker once again. Thank you, Roger, for an engaging talk and a stimulating discussion, again, for agreeing to join us virtually.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. And we hope to see you on Wednesday.
Yeah.
again.
Thank you so much, Noah and Nina. Yeah, thank you and everyone for attending and your wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank
We
you.
hope to see you in Israel.
Yes, we'd love to.
Very much.
Yes. I'm so sad I couldn't
very
go.
much.
It's like, Thank you. All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
So we will now take a 30-minute break, give or
Okay.
take, and then return for the second and final session of the pre-conference featuring our second keynote speaker, Professor Richard Mayer. Those of you who have registered should have received the Zoom link by now. I'll post it in the chat for anyone who didn't receive it or didn't register and can now join. Wait, I'll do that.
Okay.
And please join us again at 8 using the link you were sent or the one that is now posted in the chat. It's the same one. Hoping to see you all there and enjoy the break.